So I don't know if everyone can hear me. This is my first time really being on stage on this app. I just put up a tweet in at the top of my feed. If if you're so inclined, you want to share the conversation, I'd love it if you could retweet it. If you can hear me, for that matter. Lee,
Yes,
you're there.
hey, it's me. Yes. Hey, everybody, it's Lee Smith.
Fantastic.
Welcome to the improbably named Lee Smith Show. And that was my special great guest and friend, Jan Jelichek. Jan and I are going to be speaking for about a little while here, probably about an hour. And we're going to cover a whole bunch of different topics. So, Jan, welcome. And as you said, yeah, it's interesting and different to have you on this end, where you're going to be where I'm going to be asking questions, and you'll be answering them, I hope.
Well, yeah, I think it'll be a lot of fun. I've had you on the opposite end enough times now that you get to, what we say in Polish, have your revenge.
It's no revenge. This will be a fun conversation. But since we're talking about Poland, I'm going to ask you for a little bit of background on your life and before you came to American thought leaders. And I want to say, I mean, one of the remarkable things about American thought leaders, well, you've been doing it now for three years, is that right, or longer? When did you
It's
start?
just over 3 years. Just over 3 years. I think we started in early 2019. Yeah, that's right.
I think you were part of the movement, along with big podcasters like Joe Rogan and stuff. But you were really one of the first people, and you have people on video. You're really one of the first people who's gone for stuff like the extended long conversations. You moved away from to do news and reporting. You moved away from short 3.5 minute hits that we see generally on TV, whether it's Fox or CNN, and you sat down and you continue to sit down and speak with people for a long period of time. So, yeah, let's bring it up. Let's bring it up to there. It starts, as you said, in Poland, because the topic of today's show is, are we headed to communism? I thought that you, with deep knowledge about this subject, about both Poland and your coverage of the Chinese Communist Party and your coverage of events in the United States right now, I just thought that you are the ideal person to speak with about this. So if you can give us some background to your story.
Well, absolutely. I mean, so my parents, they actually left Poland or circa 1970. They had to escape from Poland. So my mother, to give you a little bit of background, my parents are both Polish, and Poland was, in Poles' minds, was occupied by Russia or the Soviet Union. For Poles, they didn't really see it all that differently, but it was under a communist system. And after the Iron Curtain came down, basically, society had to kind of conform to the Soviet way of doing things. And both my families were not the types of families that either the Nazis or the Soviets liked very much, because they didn't like authoritarians. They didn't like totality. Yeah, and so we lost a lot of people in both families. But of course, people make do and figure out how to live.
What do you mean?
Right?
What do you mean you lost a lot of people?
Well, like one of my great uncles was just caught with weapons cache and was executed by the Nazis.
Wow.
Right, and that's actually a kind of an interesting story in itself, because we had cousins that were German, and there was a cousin in the German army who came and said, his cousin came and said, hey, listen, all you have to do is renounce being Polish, and you can leave this jail with me right now. And he said, no, I can't do that, and they executed him. Right, so this is the kind of stuff that happened. And the borders, kept shifting in that area, and there were families that overlapped. I had family that came from France. I had family that was in what was Russia before the war. And anyway, they were always involved in the rebellions against Russia and so on and so forth. So by the time my mother was, basically she was actually working in this Ministry of Agriculture, and she got to this
Hmm.
level where she couldn't. Basically, she got the offer that you can't
Uh-huh.
refuse, and the offer you can't refuse is joining the Communist Party. Can you hear me? Okay, I just
Yes,
there's
yeah,
very
you've
loud
got some.
siren in the background.
You're in the
Um,
middle of
yeah,
a fantastic one of America's great cities we know, and we're hearing evidence of that in the background. But we can hear
yes,
you,
that's right.
although it's getting louder. It seems to be approaching you. Are you
Yeah.
okay? Is everything all right?
Well, I'm just on the corner of 8th and 34th, so you know
Hmm.
where the very close to where the Miracle on 34th Street Macy's is here in New York City. So
Yes.
you can get a
Yeah.
picture. It's a very dense part of the city, but
Right.
and then there's a lot of activity. But anyway, so
Yeah.
to make a long story short,
Uh-huh.
um, my mother, she got to a level in working for this, government agency that she had to join the
Hmm.
Communist Party, but she couldn't, in all due conscience, do that because of what the communists had done to our families,
Huh.
and so she refused. And at that point, she
Wow.
lost all her privileges. They pulled
What
her
year was
passport.
this? Around when was this?
This is around 1970, 1969, something like that.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Yeah. And Poland didn't have communism like China or Russia. They
Hmm.
had a kind of you could think of it like a lighter version. It was imposed, and the powers that be were very aware that if they tried to push it too hard, they'd have rebellion and it would be really
Hmm.
nasty. And also, so even the Poles themselves, the communist Poles themselves, like to stick it to the Russians because they didn't like the Russians very much.
Huh. Wait, so
So it was
this is.
kind of an unusual situation. Yeah. Hmm.
I was going to say this is interesting. How do they know? You know what I mean? Like how do they gauge how much pressure they can put on people before they think it will break? Because I mean, this is something we'll return to later when we talk about the Chinese Communist Party and especially Shanghai. But how do they gauge how much pressure that they can put on a population before it will break?
Well, so Poland was very known to the Russians, right? Because
Hmm.
prior to World War One, Poland had been partitioned for about 120 years between
Hmm.
Germany, Russia, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so in Austria-Hungary, that part of Poland was actually the free part. They were basically like, give us the money, give us the taxes, and we'll leave you alone. Do your thing. So that's kind of where Polish culture really sort of wasn't persecuted. But in the other two places, in Prussia and in Russia, there was active suppression of the language, of the culture,
Huh.
everything. So Stalin, at this time, he was acutely aware of how resilient and resistant Poles were, how many rebellions there had been, and how
I see.
little
Huh.
liking there was. So, it's a curiosity. The Polish national anthem even has this line, uh, Poland is, as long as we're still alive, Poland will live, like stuff like this, which is, very
Huh.
freedom and stop
Can you say it in
and stop.
Polish?
Jeszcze Polska nie zginęła, póki my żyjemy.
Huh. That's great.
Poland
Thanks. Yeah.
is not lost as long as we're alive, right?
Hmm.
And so you would think Stalin would get rid of a national anthem that has a line like that, but I guess he
Yeah.
liked it and he left it. So it's kind of interesting. Poland just played this interesting role, and it was always known to be, basically. It was the first place that was always attacked. It was this big plain that all the armies would roll through, but it was never pleasant for those armies when they did it.
Right.
Yeah. But anyway, so my
Um.
mother had to escape
No.
basically, and so they got one of these. So in communist societies, every office you're working in, there's the person that's in charge, and then there's the real person that's in charge, which is the political officer who pretends to just be someone working there, but really everyone defers to them. And so this guy in my mother's office had a weakness for this particular 90 proof, or sorry, 180 proof alcohol that my great aunt would make, and they got him
Uh,
drunk, and he got him to sign some papers, and my mother got her passport back, and she got away through the
wow.
border, and
Wow. I
then they didn't
had.
know they weren't married yet, right?
uh,
And then so she basically invited my father out to France. They were kind of basically like cleaning,
hmm,
being she was being like a maid,
hmm.
and she invited him out, and they got married in Paris. Yeah, so it was
Wow.
kind of interesting.
how did your father get out?
Well, you could get out, right? If they didn't believe that you had some reason that you were going to stay out, like they might know that you have a history of some, of being against the government, but you yourself haven't really done much. And, so generally they would let people out where they felt there was enough of a pull to keep them going back,
Right.
especially if they were, sort of for education, for reasons of education or something like that. That could happen, right? So so that's how he got invited out, basically. And but then they just never went back. Yeah.
You said something really moving to me, which is stuck in my head. I mean, you said it a couple months ago, and so it's not that my memory is so great. But what you said was so moving. You said that your parents were both people who recognized they were living under a regime. Can you explain
Oh,
that somewhat?
well, so this is actually this is just something that really kind of dawned on me recently. And it's funny, you get to be in your late 40s
Hmm.
before you figure stuff like this out. But I mean, and I hope my parents aren't unhappy with me because, well, so
Hmm.
I'll give you a little bit of another anecdote. One of the crazy things growing up in Toronto, Canada, and Canadian as a kid was that in my family there was a rule: there's no speaking about what happens in the family outside of the family. So if your mom is being
Oh,
tough on you or just unreasonable or insane, if you think
oh,
as a kid, right, you really can't talk about that with anybody. That would be treason. That would be family
oh.
treason, right?
Why
And so,
is
but if
that something that started when they were starting in Poland? You know what I
well,
mean?
so
That you
exactly.
wouldn't talk
So
about ah, okay. Wow.
it only dawned on me again some years later after I was interviewing Chinese dissidents, some of the religious dissidents like Falun Gong practitioners and so forth. Um, it dawned on me that the reason is that the kid will say something in public, and next thing you know, there's a truck showing up in the middle of the night and pulling mommy or daddy out of bed and into the night to Siberia, and you're gone. That's it.
Wow.
Game
Right.
over, right? So every family that had wits about it had this kind of rule. In Poland, it was
Huh.
normal, but of course, in a Western society, a free society, that's crazy. Like what you would pent all your anger. You would, and it was extremely independent kid. My mother was like the
Uh,
most overprotective mother you could imagine, and a lot of people will
yeah.
attest to this. Even the people who have overprotective mothers attest to this, right? So it was a tough relationship, right? As much as I loved
uh,
her, right? For the record, if she ever listens to this, I want her to hear
uh,
that, to hear
she'll
that. But
she'll she'll
yeah,
listen.
um,
Well,
but but anyway, what is my point here? My point is that my parents also had a kind of a tough relationship, right?
hmm.
And as a kid, I wondered, what is it that brought these people together? Because they really think
Huh.
about the world so fundamentally differently in so many ways. It's really
Huh.
odd, right? And only just last year, when I shared this with you a few months ago, or this year, it just dawned on me that as when there is a regime and you have that need for freedom, and you know it in your
Hmm.
bones because you sense it, right? You sense when that freedom is taken
Hmm.
away, you realize, wow, freedom is being taken away. But that's not everybody in society, you see. Some people
Right.
aren't attuned to that or maybe don't care about it as much for whatever reason. But for both of them, right, it's a it's obvious that that's extremely
Huh.
important to them. And it just dawned on me, like in that society, in an unfree
Wow.
society, this is the most powerful binding force. It doesn't matter what the other stuff is, right? Why? Because the
Right.
regime seeks to crush all those people,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah. Right.
suddenly, if this is like the best sort of connection you can have with someone is to be on this side of things, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
And so that's the irony that so this is one of the signals that we're experiencing some sort of shift into more authoritarianism, right? Which is that my parents who were divorced when I was 16,
Hmm.
didn't really like each other very much for a long time. Today are you know communicate fairly often and see incredibly eye to eye on all sorts of things. And they both agree that
Ah.
this system is very much in our country right now. And so
Okay.
and in fact,
Are you
anybody
Are
I've
you?
talked
Uh,
to, yeah,
no, I was
go
going to say,
ahead.
are you talking about Canada or the United States or both? Because you
I'm
grew up in
talking about
Canada.
Canada because
Yeah.
that's where they both are, or
Right.
usually. But 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 I think they would apply it equally. I think they probably would say the same. But this is the curious thing.
Huh.
See, all the people that I know, older people that left Poland for reasons of freedom or to basically um, seek liberty or seek freedom for their family or something, right? I mean, my mother was basically said, "I am not having kids in this under this system. That's my, I'm drawing the line. I have to be in a free place, right? Like it was once here." And
Yeah.
so, people have their own motivations, but all the people that left for some kind of reason like that, they all have that feeling that anyone I've ever talked to, and there's other people like Rodrier, for example, who has similarly talked to people and they say similar things, right? But on the other hand, there's people that left for reasons of economic, uncertainty and things like that, and they don't necessarily have that perception. So that's what I find so fascinating. That for some people, this freedom thing is incredibly important and in fact defining, and for others, they may not even notice that it's disappearing, and it's just so fascinating to me.
It is fascinating. This was one of the surprises. I think lots of people shared this perception that during the advent of COVID, when there were all these different lockdowns, I think it was very surprising for most people to recognize that a lot of Americans were willing to, give up their freedoms for what they perceived to be security, and it sort of showed that I believe that America is an exceptional country, but I think the idea that we pushed or the idea that we subscribed to during the Cold War, there was something homo Americanus, that all Americans by definition would fight to the very death for every freedom, and we're a stubborn people and we wouldn't allow anyone to tell us anything. I think we're surprised to find out that wasn't necessarily the case, that actually before we're Americans, we're human beings, and some human beings cherish liberty over security, and some don't.
And so, and I guess now I want to ask you a question, but I guess I'm supposed to be answering the questions. I'm just so used to asking questions.
No, it's great. No, I know it's your nature to ask questions. Me too. This is why this will be fun, and we'll just keep asking questions, and there will be no answers. But yes, no, please go ahead.
But why, do you have any insight into, for me, it's unimaginable that someone would not care about this, because I immediately feel like there's something wrong when I feel those freedoms being encroached on. And I just, it's amazing to me that there might be people out there that don't notice, right?
Yeah.
Now, of course, I realize it's real, but it just strikes me as such a fundamental part of what it is to be human.
I think that what they had to do was first, I think, and this is probably not just the United States, but anywhere, but I think what they probably, certainly what they did first was they terrorized us, right? There was a very impressive media campaign, that included public health officials. They steamrolled President Donald Trump, who was against it, but then he was, the decision was steamrolled, and then at that point, the floodgates were open, and it wasn't just, when I'm talking about floodgates, it wasn't just about COVID lockdowns. I'm talking about that's when the reign of terror began, right? That's when the press just pushed this insane campaign, and everyone was jumping aboard. And so at that point, I think once people were terrified, look, I remember me and my wife at first, we were, even though I reported Russiagate, even though we've seen everything, we know how badly these people lie and what lunatics they are. But even we, for the first few days, we have to wash plastic bags now that come from the supermarket. And then we finally conclude, no, this is bad. It's obviously COVID is a real thing, but they're trying to turn this into the bubonic plague, and that it is not. And so also then, you can't live if you worry about washing your bags your plastic bags every time you come back from the supermarket. So I think that was the prerequisite. They had to terrorize people, not just terrify, but they had to terrorize people, right? And this is what we've seen both in the United States and I think more especially in Canada, how they how they've brought law authorities into it. They've used courts. So I think that was a large part of it. once people were pressured, that's when they said, well, I don't know, how important is my liberty compared to what they're telling me is very likely a gruesome death in a hospital in a ventilator.
Well, so here's I'll tell you a couple of interesting things, and this is a bit of a confession too, I think, on my side, perhaps. But of course, I've done a lot of coverage of sort of the realities around COVID, and
Your
but
coverage, I should
originally,
just say, I'm sorry for stepping in, but I just want to say, I mean, the different people that you've brought on and the different people that you introduced, both here in the United States and elsewhere around the world, people who are presenting necessary, important, vital views, not just on freedom, but on medical care, on COVID, on the public health establishment. And I mean, this is just, I mean, the work that you did, and of course, colleagues at Epoch Times, but especially you bringing all these people on. So just, well, congratulations, first of all, and second of all, thank you. And I think I'm speaking for probably millions of people, even if they don't know that it starts with Epoch Times, with the number of people that you in particular, put in public view, who provided this information. Just amazing.
well, but I have to tell you, I was kind of blinded to the reality of COVID in a lot of ways early on, and I suspect there were a lot of people that were in my boat. And the reason, in my case, right, I was sort of shocked and stunned that Nature and a number of magazines basically published these articles talking about COVID origins, where they were saying that there's no way the origin could have been lab oriented. It had to be natural, and this was just preposterous. I have a background, in molecular biology and evolutionary biology, and I haven't been in it for 20 years, but I know enough to know that
Yeah.
was just totally.
This
There's no
this is
way that
important.
was true, right? There's just
I,
simply no
I was
way
going to
that
ask you
was
to
true.
talk about your background. What, there's no way that what was true, that it could not
Well,
have come from a lab?
right. Well, no, basically, it's one thing to say the preponderance of evidence suggests that it's natural, right? And that certainly wasn't the case, because we had done the research, and the preponderance of evidence suggested that the labs were involved in some way,
Right.
right? But what these guys did was different. They didn't even just say the preponderance of evidence said, and these are like Nobel level. These are
Yeah,
people who
yeah,
are
right.
funded, are running massive
Yeah,
organizations globally.
right.
Um, you know,
Which is
and
the point, of course, right? Their ties to the public health establishment, right? That's unfortunately, that appears to be one of the reasons
right.
why they were eager to tell these tales.
Well, so I was obsessed with this because in our April of 2020, we did a documentary talking about the origins. It's simply all the
Hmm.
documentary said, and was immediately labeled as the worst of fake news, and we were racist and all this kind of stuff,
Hmm.
because we said, well, it's quite likely there's a lab involvement here, because
Yeah.
there's this researcher that's the world expert on exactly these viruses, doing
Right.
exactly the kind of research that would result in a
Yeah.
virus like this in this lab, which has questionable
Yeah.
containment. Anyway, there's a whole ton of circumstantial evidence of this nature that would, and no evidence in the other direction, basically, other than the Chinese Communist Party perspective, which of course is always the politics, nothing to do with reality. It incidentally could have something to do with
Hmm.
reality, but it's never focused on that. So
Right.
anyway, I was flabbergasted by this. We were exploring it, but so I just kind of but when we decided to lock down, right? I didn't realize that. There's people like, Jeffrey Tucker, who I've since gotten to know, for example. When Jeffrey Tucker saw these
Huh.
lockdowns, he had been this huge cheerleader for modernity, right, for years.
Huh.
And suddenly he looks at this situation, he says to himself, civilization as we know it is over. And I,
It's dire.
and
Yeah.
that's prescient. No, but the,
Huh.
the point was that, we've worked all these years, all these centuries, decades to
Hmm.
create the freest, most prosperous society in the history of the world, and now we've just thrown it all out somehow,
Huh.
right? All
Right.
the presuppositions that allowed for that to happen have just been tossed, and so that's what he saw. I didn't
Right.
see that. Right? I mean,
Huh.
he's brilliant that way. What I just
Yeah.
saw, oh, I guess we have to, 2 weeks to slow the spread. I'll do my part,
Yeah.
it didn't occur to me that there might be something similar going on with that, as was going on with the virus origins, for example, because I was so focused on the virus origins. right? And I
I see.
suspect with
I
a lot
see.
of
That's
other people,
right.
right,
Yeah.
they would have been just going about their lives, doing their thing, and they just, and just, yeah, well, do your part for society. That was kind of the message, right?
Yeah.
And
Right.
who doesn't want to do their part for society?
Sure.
Most
We're all
people
in
do,
this.
and it takes
We're
a
all in
really
this together.
special,
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
it takes a very special person to just sort of look at it really from the outside, especially when they're saying the
Right.
numbers could be so dire and
Right.
everything. And what I should have known is, hey, wait a second, all this stuff is coming from the CCP, and they're
Yeah.
always lying, and this is really in
Yeah.
their
Yeah.
interest
Right.
to lock us down, right?
Right.
So anyway, yeah. So it took me a little while. It took me realizing that Ron DeSantis down in
Oh,
Florida was doing something really interesting that seemed to be working and against the grain, and
right.
me wanting to kind of study that and understand it was what sort of opened up my eyes to this whole reality.
Well,
Yeah.
then you guys did a great documentary about Governor DeSantis.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I know that was
yeah.
so much fun to do. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk about the Chinese Communist Party and its lies. Um, and I mean, I want to come back to communism. I mean, is this, I've asked people, I mean, even last week, I mean, I had Michael Sanger and Jordan Schachtel on here. I remember asking Michael, saying, well, look, how much of the Shanghai lockdowns are, they really believe in the zero COVID thing, or how much of this is performative, how much of it is theater? And he said, it's a communist party. So in a sense, even the real things are theater. And I think that's kind of what you're saying in terms of, look, it came from the CCP. Of course, it's a lie. Why? What is it about the nature of communist regimes? I mean, as as someone who was born into people who fled a regime like this, and now who looks at this very carefully, and who's seeing it in different places like Canada and the U.S. Why? Why are these regimes built on lies? Or what are the most important lies that they're built on?
Well, that's a big question, Lee.
I know. I know.
Maybe
We
I
can
could
break it. We can
start.
break it down slowly. Yeah, we can take it slowly.
Maybe.
How about this? I've got another way into it, because you said something, and I wanted to ask you before, when you said your mother and father now speak about how they're recognizing certain things that they saw in Poland. So what is it that they're seeing in Canada? What is it that they see in the United States that reminds them of Poland? What are the lies, or what are the stories? What's the nature of such a regime that makes it so easy for them to recognize it? So that's a way into the lies. How's that?
The thing that is the most overt, okay, and this is the thing that I think for me changed my thinking about, frankly, what was happening in America and in America, actually. This was in 2015, right? And when I was watching, I'd been, watching China and how the Chinese media operate for a very long time, right? And they're all state media, and there's controlled opposition, and they all operate a certain way. And there's a lot of very deliberate narrative control going on, right? And what I saw in 2015 happened, shocked me, and I still had to talk to a bunch of people saying, "Are you seeing what I'm seeing?" Was that the media suddenly started doing something like that, like a kind of
Huh.
ubiquitous. I'm talking about the corporate media in the U.S., right? They
Right.
all had
Right.
kind of the same line in different ways and complemented each other. It was like, and I was like, what is this? Is this like, is there a central party organizing
Yeah.
these people? Because I'd seen what this looks like, right? And it was, and conservatives will say,
Huh.
well, this has always been there, Jan. You're just blind to it, and perhaps, and that's true. But something changed in 2015. It really did, because I didn't see it didn't operate like that, and suddenly there was this sort of incredible party line, and also this kind of vilification of people that don't follow that
Hmm.
line in a level that I had never seen before. And of course, it existed in different, maybe at a
Can,
different level as well. But
can
yeah.
can you remember the particular stories that you noticed this around? I mean, I know the story that I was following at the time, where I thought, I picked up on the exact same thing you're talking about, which was the Iran nuclear deal, the Obama administration's key foreign policy initiative. So for you, what was it? Were there particular stories, or you just saw it everywhere with everything they were writing or speaking about?
I think for me it was when the moment when the Trump candidacy for president became a reality. I think because I remember seeing this. I remember watching, like, what was that guy's name? John Oliver, kind of like
Yes,
sort of
right,
daring Trump to run, and
right.
there's all this kind of,
Funny man, John Oliver. Yeah,
yeah, there's just all this. I used to watch John Oliver,
yeah,
the I was watching. There's just a lot of, no one really thought he would. I didn't think he would, and it was just kind of, and then suddenly, right, so things shift around, move around, and suddenly he's got the nomination, and he's going for it, and the system changes. I mean, melts down. I don't
yeah,
know what you want to call it, but the attack, like
right,
the anything, any level of attack is acceptable. I don't remember exactly. I just
right,
remember this. It was unbelievable. It
yeah,
was like this machine kind of roared into operation, that reminded me of other machines I'd seen, right?
huh,
In operation. And it took me a while to figure out what was going on, because I just hadn't seen it. People call it getting red pilled, right? And that was me getting red
hmm,
pilled. That something really weird was happening, and I tend to like underdogs. And obviously Trump was very much an underdog. So in that respect, I
yeah,
liked him. I liked some of his policy ideas. He had really good ideas around China, which was always my focus.
yeah,
And I, but at the same time, I had lots of questions because there were all sorts of people, including, Bill Clinton, for example,
hmm,
who campaigned on being really tough on China, and then the moment they got in, they were the opposite of really tough on China. It was just kind of like
right.
the way that the American political establishment operated for ages. Let me see if I can actually, like, quiet down these fire
I think
engines are just unbelievable
I
today.
I think they're bugging. I don't think you're gonna be able to quiet them down. I think they're bugging you, but we can hear you fine, and it adds a
Okay,
certain
okay,
amount of urgent. It adds a certain amount, even yet more urgency to your utterance. So it's good. It works
yeah.
fine.
But just to go back to that, this idea of narrative control. There's so communist regimes. They're obsessed with narrative control. They're obsessed with
Hmm.
information control. That's why the Great Firewall of China exists and was built,
Hmm.
by the way, by American companies, by the way. But that's a whole nother
Right.
story. Um, to if you can control the information that's getting to the populace, even though some portion of the population knows it's false, a lot of people know there's a lot of things that are false, but they don't know what's false and what
Hmm.
isn't. And you can actually exert an incredible amount of control, right? And in communist societies, truth is a very different thing than what we think
Hmm.
of traditionally as truth. We think of truth as something we seek to try to discover an actual truth. Truth in a communist societies is the will of the party. Whatever that
Huh.
is, that's truth, right? And that's the reason why communist parties are so obsessed with narrative control, because from their perspective, they need to enact truth
Huh.
onto their societies, right? And so the moment that you see
Right.
stuff like that happening in a society, and that's what I think my parents are the most sort of
Huh.
sensitive to, because it's the moment you start seeing that, you're like, okay, so this is now we're
Fascinating.
not, yeah.
That's fascinating. So you're saying that the obsession with controlling the narrative, that in itself is an indicator of um, of a regime that is at least if it isn't already, but that it may be on its way to totalitarianism.
Absolutely. Well, why would you be
Yeah,
why would you be so concerned with that,
right,
right? Otherwise, like, why wouldn't you let people have their own thoughts,
right, right.
um
You said something about Bill Clinton a couple moments ago. How he
mhm.
campaigned, of course, in '92 on human rights in China, and then, of course, in '94 he abandoned that. And then in 2000, China's granted most favored nation status in trade. In 2001, it joins the World Trade Organization. So this has been going on for a long time, and um, American policymakers had lots of opportunities, starting perhaps with Tiananmen Square in 1989, to say, guys, let's reevaluate our ideas about China right now. We have these dreams about being able to liberalize it, but frankly, it doesn't look good. Look at what they just did in Tiananmen Square here. It looks to me like Shanghai, what's happening in Shanghai, and of course other cities around China. It looks to me as though this is such an enormous event that people will not be able to ignore it, even though, of course, I don't think it's getting a fraction of the coverage that it merits in our media. But everything from not just locking down 25 million people in the world's third largest city, but their supply chains are entirely broken. That means Americans are going to be feeling it even worse before long. So is there a way to look at this and say, well, it's really bad, but maybe the U.S. relationship with China is finally coming to an end. Now, finally, they will have no choice but to decouple us from this monstrous regime, this inhuman institution known as the Chinese Communist Party.
I think, again, to use your and my favorite word, apparently, fascinating. I find it incredibly fascinating to see this being enacted, because obviously the cost to the regime, first of all, even a cursory honest assessment of the science now will leave you knowing very clearly that zero COVID is not something you can pursue with success. It's not going to work. So either, and this is one of the sort of problems with communist societies, or societies heading in that direction, right? Where, sort of the media, the media says things, and maybe you start believing what the media that is your own propaganda, your leader is saying. So maybe, I don't know how much that is happening there, but I, this is the part I'm not clear on. Does Xi Jinping and the ruling class really understand that zero COVID is a pipe dream and not real, and they're doing this nonetheless for another purpose entirely, or do they believe that, or the second option is, are they stuck because their biggest success, and they've been trumpeting this for ages, and I'm sure there's an element of this, right, is that we conquered COVID. Look, we only had 5,000 deaths, right? It's preposterous. But,
it's insane,
official,
right?
That's the official line, right? And this is the great party was victorious, and the great leader was victorious over COVID. Look, and all the rest of the world is totally screwed, but we won, and this is how we won, through lockdown. So now what can we do? Well, if we stop locking down, I guess that means that we're not, maybe it'll create doubts in people's minds or something, right? So there's that element as well. So that might be that's certainly part of it. Or is there some other agenda altogether, right? There's this huge supply chain backup, which is like there's going to be a massive supply chain cost, sort of breakage cost to these lockdowns. I mean, this is 300 million people locked down, right? For the U.S., for other countries, for the U.S., for so forth. So we're going to feel that. Is that intentional? I don't know. These are interesting questions, right?
Yeah, I've heard a lot of interesting speculation on that. I was speaking with a finance guy last week, his point was, he said, I think we've reached peak China. I'm like, what do you mean? He said, well, this is a broken thing, and it's always been a broken thing, right? The way it projects externally, it looks very impressive, right? And it's a communist party, so they can command labor. They don't have to worry about how much they're going to pay people. But in fact, if you look inside, internal facing China is a different thing. And that's what we're seeing now. I mean, these horrific videos about not just people, screaming outside their windows, but people. It seems that many people are taking their own lives, and the beating to death, pets. It just looks absolutely insane. So this gentleman, and I've heard other people say this too, are saying, no, I don't think I don't think it's intentional. I just think he says he just thinks they're incoherent and they've lost it, which seems plausible to me too. that it's not a large plan to undermine or to make Americans feel more pain, though of course Americans will feel more pain, but that wasn't really the intention. They don't mind that result, but it wasn't the intention. It's just what the Chinese Communist Party really is.
Well, so one of the things that's very characteristic of communist parties, and this is very much along in line with our theme here, is
Mm,
just that communism doesn't value the individual person. It just
right.
does not value the individual. So it's kind of like you can think of it like as biomass or something,
Mm,
right? That
yeah.
that that
Yeah.
is there sort of incidentally, and so that when you see that people being treated that way in an increasing way, that's another hint, I think, that
Huh.
you're heading towards an authoritarian, totalitarian, or communist system.
When you see
Because
people being
yeah,
treated as though they're just soulless bags of meat, is that what you mean? Biomass, as you put it?
yeah, exactly.
Uh,
So basically, this is one of the things that someone, again, like I mentioned Jeffrey Tucker because he was really prescient.
uh,
I mean, you can see him writing right away after these lockdowns happened about
he's a
this,
really
right?
interesting
We
writer.
just gave
Yeah,
up.
he's very interesting. Yeah.
We gave up our liberties. We're willing
Right.
to give up our liberties, maybe for 2 weeks, okay, right? Maybe if we're gonna,
Yeah.
but it just kind of keeps going, and no one seems to be worried about it. More importantly, the powers that be, I'll say that in quotes, are quite happy to keep doing that, right?
Yes.
And but that reflects a certain kind of mentality in our society that also maybe, this certainly wasn't the mentality of the founding fathers, right?
Right.
Um, and in, of course, and the apotheosis of that is in a society like communist China, where you have a murder for organs industry, that's
Right.
billions of dollars a year, right? So
Right. Well, this is one of the things that, well, you and I have spoken about this often, the idea that this is what the American ruling class has tied us to, this monstrous regime. And again, that's why looking at Shanghai, I don't think anyone can actually turn their face away from it at this point, right? It's not just that it's a vicious totalitarian regime, but I mean, they're also nuts. And so, yeah, so it's my hope that out of this horrible catastrophe, that American policymakers will finally say, we don't have a choice. We can't partner with these nuts anymore. Everything is clearly broken there. Um,
I guess, but so here's my question, right?
yeah,
What are we willing to tolerate on the outside? I mean, I think everybody understands there's a genocide in Xinjiang, meaning there's,
right.
a whole ethnic group of people is being exterminated, not as quickly as the Nazis were doing in the 40s, but
Yeah,
nonetheless, the program is there and it's done in all sorts of terrible ways. Um, and I would argue there's at least three groups that are being, exterminated or eradicated is the term they tend to use to translate it correctly in China. The Tibetans and the Falun Gong practitioners
mm-hmm.
as well, because they're, kind of quote unquote undesirable. So we know
Right,
this, right? And so now
right,
we're looking and we say, okay, well, now we see that the whole population in these cities is being treated in this incredibly inhumane way, not as extreme as genocide, but
right.
obviously, nothing to do with human liberty here. And also, I might add, for no good reason. That's the terrible part. But I don't think a lot of people fully understand that part yet,
Yeah,
right? That the
right.
lockdowns have massive collateral damage and almost no benefit. That's what all the studies
Yes,
basically
right,
show. Like, i.e., there's just a wild disproportion between the cost and the benefit, if there is any benefit at all.
right.
Um, and this just happens. So is this the thing that suddenly American society or the American elite says, okay, wow, this is now we've really passed the Rubicon here. But
Right.
yeah, I feel like there's just so many ways in which we've passed the Rubicon. Why would this one be any different?
No, I do too. And I mean, it started, as I said, with Tiananmen. I think that was the point. 1989, people should have said, wait a minute. We'd all like to bring China in from the cold. And now that we see the Soviet Union uh, failing, we can understand why it's a triumphalist moment for Western democracies. But let's slow down here. before we try to integrate these guys into the world system. This seems to be a very, very, very unhealthy regime. I want to ask you, this is dealing with China, but look, that you may be the person who knows best. Like, how would we refer to it? As the American opposition, right? Whether we're talking about journalists that you've interviewed on American thought leaders, whether it's politicians like Governor DeSantis, former Secretary of State Pompeo, just tons and tons of people, right? So you have as clear a sense as anyone as what the people, medical professionals, investigators, you and Kash Patel do your great Epoch Times show, Cash's Corner. So you have an insight, a rare insight into what we can only really call now the American opposition, what it looks like. Are you optimistic? Because here we are, we're talking about an encroaching totalitarian or growing totalitarian shadow hovering over the United States. And you've seen people up close who are fighting this. Are you optimistic? Well, what's your sense of it?
I say I have good days and I have bad days.
All
But
right.
well, for starters, I can tell you that I am an eternal optimist. So I want to let everyone
Yeah.
understand my biases, right? Because I've been working on the China issue for over 20 years. So if you're not an optimist, you wouldn't be doing that anymore. Okay, like basically based on what we've seen. So I am very optimistic, but I tend to be optimistic, just simply because there's actually, COVID is really what made me particularly optimistic. I know this sounds bizarre, right?
No,
Because on
it
one hand,
sounds really interesting. Yeah, how?
we're seeing society kind of, sort of really digress into old patterns that we thought we had grown out of. But no, just I the thing that I saw over COVID, and here's one example. Okay, so schools went offline, right? Schools went in
Right.
virtual for a long time, again for literally no good reason, right? And we've known that for for basically almost the entirety of the pandemic. It's crazy, right? It's crazy. Like we could have just sort of done the thinking that the Swedes did, and the very few other countries. But no, actually, schools, a lot of countries didn't lock down because the data was so clear that kids weren't really affected that heavily by this virus. But anyway, the silver lining around this is that all sorts of parents started listening to what their kids were being taught in school. Okay. And so, I mean, I've heard this story countless times. I won't say hundreds, but like, more than 100, okay, times.
Right.
Where people are saying, yeah, and I was listening and I was like, what? What are they teaching them? No,
Yeah.
this is not what I signed up
Right.
for. This is not your job,
Right.
teacher. I'm the parent here. So
Yeah.
there's this whole move because of COVID, among other things. I mean, there's all sorts of people that are, sort of taking back their own health care, for lack of a better term, or understand that they have to be responsible for their own healthcare decisions.
Yeah.
That's one thing. Another thing is people looking at education and just kind of being activated and saying, "Whoa, man! Like I don't know what happened. I had no idea this was going on." But now there's just all these activated people, right? Like most people aren't, activists. They don't want to be,
right. People are busy.
active or,
Right. People are busy.
Yes.
They have their work. They have their families. And right. So they don't have time to be activists. Oh, right. But if they're put up against it, and they love their families and they love their communities, they realize they have to step up and do something about it.
Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of examples of this, but so what the thing that I find incredibly inspiring is that there's all sorts of people who weren't particularly civically active, okay, that have over the last few years become incredibly civically active, and in fact, because in fact, that's the only way that you can kind of change things for the better is to have a lot of people that are active to try to make it that way. And I might add that the optimism element, it's like I kind of like I have my bad days, right? But like you just have to you have to look at yourself in those bad days and say, I just can't do this very often because
Right.
basically if you that's how you feel, then the things that you cherish and you love and are beautiful, they
Right.
might fade away. And so you gotta, you either gotta, for me it's truth seeking, right? Like
Yeah.
that's what I love. I happen to fall into doing probably the favorite job I could ever have in my life, which is, get to ask, interesting people questions about things I'm interested in. I mean, you didn't
Yeah.
get paid for it. That's pretty wonderful.
Yeah.
And maybe even
That's
make the
great.
world a better place along the way. Wow. That's
Yeah.
perfect, right? Like what
Yeah.
better job could
Right.
you have, right?
No,
But
you're
but
right.
so so
Absolutely.
so I love that, and I cherish
Uh,
it, and so that's the best way that I know how to contribute. I don't know
uh,
if it's going to work, right? I don't know if it's going to work, but I love helping, and this is what people tell me. I love helping give people the tools so that they can think
uh,
about the world, a little more with a little more of an open mind, to find some new resources, get motivated, and that's
uh,
that's how things change in a positive way. If we feel if it looks really bad every day and you kind of give up, then it is the
right.
end, isn't it?
It's struck me recently that we've lived as Americans, as North Americans, even as Western Europeans, I guess, have lived a remarkable age for the most part, peace and prosperity since the Second World War, and we've been so blessed and so lucky, and it's harder now. It's getting harder, but this is what it's like for most people at most times throughout history, and I feel if it's our place, our generation, our families now who have to fight this fight to sustain the things, right, the things that we love, right, whether it's uh, whether it's books, whether it's art, whether it's the outdoors, whether it's good dinners, whether it's family, freedoms, and so, yeah, why not? So we're actually, I think, blessed to have to fight like this. Who are the people? Who are the people you've spoken with that inspired you or gave you different ideas that you hadn't thought about before for American thought leaders? I don't want you to pick on anyone, but say the things that you really enjoyed. Like who are the people? Yeah, who are the people who you found inspiring? And that their ideas were things you hadn't thought about before.
Well, the immediate one that comes to my mind is Yeonmi Park.
Hmm.
So she's the North Korean dissident,
Uh
um,
huh.
and she, basically, it's worth. I'll plug her book
Hmm.
here because it's really worth reading her book. It's an unbelievable piece of work. It's very difficult to get out of North Korea,
Hmm.
and in her case, she got out by being human trafficked to
Huh.
China first. And anyway, all sorts of crazy things happen along the way, and she, comes out the other end, a very thoughtful person,
Right.
despite all sorts of horrors that she encountered, or partially because of that, right? Like these
Right.
things shape you as well. And so one of the things that she notes, right, is there's this guy who's basically her, I don't know, call it her pimp, right,
Hmm.
basically.
Uh huh.
And by the way, the reason that she is able to kind of live a semi decent life is she threatens to
Hmm.
kill herself with this guy unless he treats her a certain way, and he has
Huh.
this kind of weakness for her. So he knows, basically she's like, and she said, I was ready to do it, and he knew it, right?
Wow.
So she just had that kind of personality. But anyway,
Huh.
it turns out the guy, in the end, rescues her parents from North Korea,
Huh.
right? And
Wow.
so she has this weird relationship with this guy. He's raped her. He wanted to traffic
Uh
her. He rescued her parents, so she hates him, but she
huh.
also appreciates he did something which, of course, he never had to do. She could have just, kind of killed her and thrown her in a dark hole, right?
Right.
Which is what happens to a lot of these ladies that,
Huh.
so anyway, so her thought, she got through life through the reason I mention this situation is, right, she has the compassion and the thoughtfulness to be able to look at a really horrible human being like this, this Chinese trafficker, and also see an element of goodness and see that the relationship is complicated, right? Despite everything that has happened. And so that type of thing to me, frankly, gives me a lot of hope for humanity, because the thing that I find most troubling is this sort of black and white, you're the enemy. This is exactly kind of the whole kind of woke ideology, the way it works. If you don't fully agree with my way of looking at the world, you're a Nazi or you're Hitler or something like that. It's a very extreme way of thinking.
Silence is violence. Yes, whatever slogans they're right.
Right, and you can't, if you think, if we're conditioned to think like that, we will kill each other. There will be mass strife. There will be, basically war, and all the time.
Is this
if we can find the goodness in each other, even though we know that we've done terrible things.
Is this what communist regimes do? Is this what totalitarian regimes do, or doesn't that create instability? Like, what is this language meant to do here in the United States? Is it meant to drive us to conflict with each other? Is it meant to police people and terrorize them so that if they start to say anything out of line, they know that they'll be destroyed by the mob? I mean, is it driving us to conflict?
But the scariest thing about, for lack of a better term, woke ideology, that I realized, having studied it for however many years now, is that ultimately, by the people who are true ideologues, right? Ultimately, its purpose is to destroy the foundations of Western civilization, and that includes everything that came from the Enlightenment, everything. Right. So that's why, people would say, well, it won't go into the STEM disciplines in university. No, it goes into the STEM disciplines. It goes into everything, because it seeks to quote unquote decolonize everything. So in other words, remove the Western element of everything, which is most of it in a lot of cases, because a lot of the most, I just had Douglas Murray on the show. That'll go next Tuesday. We talked about that, like some of the, a lot of the things that define a lot of how the world works today that are great are Western things, right? And wokeism seeks to remove that from everything. Now, of course, there's a lot of other people that are kind of, along for the ride, and believe that it is really, that they're really helping in the cause of justice and social justice and so forth. And I realize that, but this is also how communists, wokeism has this element of communist ideology. It's kind of a fusion of postmodernism and communism, but where there's always these what Lenin called the useful idiots, right? The people that can be used to achieve revolution, because they're really, they have the good intention and they want to change society for the better. But then what happens is, once revolution is achieved, those people are the ones that go up against the wall first. Right. Because then they're the ones that are saying, "Hey, you're being authoritarian. Hey, this isn't the way I envisioned this." And it's like, sorry,
yeah, that's right.
Now,
right. You're right. You're not being true to the party's true ideology. Right. It's like, that's your problem for misunderstanding what the.
I do think that a lot of the people involved in this, the modern what they call social justice. I don't think there's any justice about it, but are well-meaning, actually, and it's just a much smaller percentage that really understand what they're doing and seek to again sort of shake the foundations and destroy everything, so that they can, of course, the goal is to rebuild this new utopian world on the ashes of the old one. Except the thing is, they don't, from anything I can tell, and I've really looked hard, they don't have a vision for that. So it's even kind of worse than other systems in that respect. They don't have a plan for when they destroy the existing system. Yeah.
We're gonna close in 1 second, but before I let you go, well, first of all, thank you, Jan. This has really been a great conversation. But we started talking about Poland, and then we moved into China and communism, and Poland is, of course, one of the great strongholds of Western civilization, and we're different, and you're talking right now about how wokeism tries to destroy the foundations of Western civilization. How sturdy is Western civilization, right? I mean, Poland Poland was under communism for decades, and now it appears that Poland is again one of the, one of the beacons of democracy and also national sovereignty and love and patriotism, Polish patriotism. So if the United States is going through a difficult, trying period right now, how sturdy are these foundations? We say, well, look, we're a constitutional republic, and we're taking a beating right now in many ways, but we'll be okay. Or are these foundations really vulnerable? What does the experience of Poland tell us, for instance?
Wow, that's another big question. But again, I'm very optimistic, right? I'm a very optimistic person, and I've been over the last 3 years of American thought leaders. I've had the privilege of learning from some of, I really think, the greatest minds on this type of question that you just asked me, and that one of the things I learned, for example, were how incredibly beautiful the idea of the United States was, and how this idea of separation of powers and this idea of basically minimizing the power, because the assumption being that people will try to take power and control absolutely, and thereby create all sorts of hellish realities, right? How can we do it to make the system inefficient so that it's hard to allow that concentration of power to actually happen? So I think, the U.S. is, the U.S. I don't know how many people realize this fully, right? Because I certainly didn't really understand this, but most of the liberal democracy that we see out there is modeled after the U.S. actually, right? And even though it's it's different, and it's maybe not the constitutional republic, they function differently, but the point is that it is a very resilient system, but it's being tested in a way now. I think that it isn't being tested, that it's never been tested, because most of the major institutions have been kind of sort of permeated by this ideology, which is sort of of unreality, of again this belief that narrative defines reality is part of that, of course. And
do you think the CCP has played a big
role? Resilient. I think this. Just to answer your question, I think the system is resilient. My big fear, to exactly your point just now that you were adding onto, is the question is, can a weakened America, an America so weakened internally, not understanding its greatness and the value that it provides, not just to itself but the entire world, can it survive the onslaught of a brutal communist dictatorship in the form of the Chinese Communist Party, which seeks to usurp it and and become the kind of global hegemon? That's an interesting question, and I don't know the answer. That's where I feel that's the big fear to me. I think if it wasn't for that, I think it probably would make it and would flourish again. But I'm worried about that.
It's fascinating when you said, excuse me, when you said that lots of the liberal democracies are in various ways patterned after the United States, and sometimes I think, well, had the founding fathers not existed, had they not founded the United States of America, what would have been the model? I mean, presumably, maybe other people would have tried it, but that's not a certainty. And yes, if the Chinese Communist Party becomes the de facto model of governance, and it certainly seems, looking at places like Canada, looking at places, tragically, like Australia and New Zealand, it seems like and different states here in the United States, it seems like that's what a lot of people seem to prefer right now.
Yeah, they don't understand what they're preferring. Like there's this idea. I think my Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has talked about how he admires the basic dictatorship of the CCP. I think that's what you're referring to, right? I think there is.
He's one of the few who's spoken about it openly, right?
Yeah. But so I do think there's that admiration, but I don't think. I mean, of course, it's not. I don't think where these places are at, you can really compare them to what what you're
Right.
seeing in China right now is the CCP enacting, right?
Yeah.
That's the future if you want to go that way, right? Like this is that
Right.
perhaps this is one of the greatest sort of gifts of that. What we're seeing right now over there is to be like, hey, wait a second, maybe we don't want
Right.
that, right? Like this
Exactly.
is
If you right, that's where this will go.
yeah,
It's not just that this is the logical conclusion of COVID zero or zero COVID, but this is the true face of the CCP, right? It's not a bunch of slick businessmen. Um, it's this. It's a bunch of people in white suits beating pets to death in the middle of the street, of one of the world's most populous cities. That's what it looks like. Um, well, Jan, I can't thank you enough for speaking with me today and for speaking with our great audience here. And this was so interesting and so great. I want to thank you for your time and insights. And again, thank you for all you've done, um, for not just for me certainly, but for lots of other people at American Thought Leaders, and especially for your awesome viewing audience. I mean, the different stuff that you've put in front of people for people to learn from, for people to absorb this information and these insights. So, thank you for everything, including thank you for being a friend.
no, and I can't even believe we were talking for an hour. Is this what happens in the wee hours of the morning? We actually talk for these long periods of time. I didn't really even realize that, but no, it's
Sometimes,
an
yes.
honor and a pleasure. Likewise, I said, Lee, you've been a great mentor in many ways, and
Oh,
I
that's very
greatly
nice.
appreciate that.
That's nice. Uh,
And
That's very kind.
and thank you. And I hope we can do something like this again sometime in the near future.
I'll look forward to it. And again, thank you everyone who's been listening in today. And I'll be back next Saturday, 4 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Pacific. In the meantime, have a great rest of your weekend. God bless. Remember, we're fighting. That's what Jan and I are talking about. We're all still fighting, and we're doing great. All right, Jan. I'll talk to you later. Thanks again.
Thanks a lot. Bye bye.
Bye.